Robert's expression gradually darkened. Deep wrinkles etched themselves along with his furrowed brow, and for a long moment, the hallway fell silent. The other children instinctively stepped back, sensing an adult storm brewing. Even the echo of distant hymns from the sanctuary seemed to fade. "Lily," Robert said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that made even the marble floor seem to tremble. "Who told you there's a difference in class between you and Emma?" Lily hesitated, glancing nervously toward the church doors as if seeking rescue. "Grandma said so," she whispered finally, her voice so small it almost vanished. At that moment, Robert's entire being froze. He had known for months, perhaps even years, that Margaret's obsession with social appearances had grown poisonous. But to hear the venom coming from his granddaughter's innocent lips shattered something inside him. He turned abruptly and strode toward the sanctuary. Inside, the pastor's calm sermon about humility and compassion flowed smoothly, interrupted only by the soft turning of hymn book pages. The congregation sat in perfect decorum, women in pearl earrings, men in tailored suits, the air filled with polished civility. Then the sound came, a single word, cutting through the stillness like thunder. "Margaret." Every head turned. The pastor paused mid-sentence, his hand frozen in the air. "Margaret," Robert repeated, louder this time. His deep, commanding voice, once used to address corporate boards, now reverberated off the vaulted ceiling of the sanctuary. The stained glass windows caught the sunlight, scattering fractured colors across his face, anger illuminated in hues of crimson and gold. Margaret turned, startled. "Robert, what's the matter with you? This is church." Her voice was low but tremulous, aware of the hundreds of eyes now fixed on them. "I want an explanation," Robert said, his voice trembling not from weakness but from years of restrained fury finally breaking loose. "Why the difference between our granddaughters? Answer me, before Christ himself." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. "Robert, not here." Margaret's voice quavered, but her husband didn't waver. "For 40 years, he continued, I have stood by your side, every church service, every charity gala, every social event, and yet today, I see clearly what I was blind to for decades. You've built our family's reputation on pride, appearances, and cruelty disguised as refinement." His voice rose, echoing through the sacred space. "What appearance justifies crushing a child's heart?" Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Her hands shook slightly, clutching the hymnal like a shield. "I've heard enough," Robert went on, his eyes glistening with both fury and heartbreak. "The presents, the favoritism, the humiliation. You call it class, I call it sin." Even the organist stopped playing. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy of shame and revelation. Somewhere in the back pew, Jennifer sat frozen, tears spilling down her cheeks. Beside her, Emma buried her face in her mother's arms, trembling. Robert looked toward them, his expression softening for just a moment. "Emma," he said, his voice gentler now, "come here." Slowly, the little girl approached, her small steps echoing in the silent church. When she reached him, Robert knelt, his old knees creaking against the polished wood. He wrapped his arms around her, the same strong arms that had once carried her mother, Jennifer, decades ago. "Grandpa will make this right," he whispered, "I promise, before God." Emma's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of relief, of being seen, of finally being defended. Margaret stood motionless, the color draining from her face. Murmurs spread through the congregation, soft at first, then louder. Even among the elders, shocked whispers broke the heavy silence. "This is not the love our church preaches," Robert declared, turning toward the pastor. "Christ's teachings speak of equality, compassion, humility. What example have we shown our grandchildren if we let vanity rule our hearts?" The pastor, visibly moved, placed a hand over his chest. "Brother Thompson," he said softly, "perhaps today's sermon has found its truest voice." Margaret could bear no more. Her composure cracked, and she turned on her heels, leaving the sanctuary. The sharp clicking of her Christian Dior heels echoed through the aisle as she exited, her face hidden behind trembling hands. The sound followed her all the way to the church doors, a queen dethroned in her own court. The aftermath. From that Sunday, Margaret Thompson's world began to crumble. At First Presbyterian Church, her influence evaporated overnight. Once the darling of every committee and tea party, she now found herself quietly replaced. At the next charity bazaar, Elizabeth Montgomery, the new president of the Women's Association, approached her delicately. "Margaret," she said, voice tight with discomfort, "about this year's charity bazaar, we've decided to review the officer selections." The meaning was unmistakable. Margaret nodded faintly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I see." By the following week, whispers filled the church hallways. Friends she had once hosted in her rose garden pretended not to see her. At choir practice, no one sat beside her. Invitations to luncheons, bridge clubs, and country club teas vanished one by one. The invisible social ladder she had climbed for 40 years was now collapsing under her feet. At home, the isolation grew heavier. Catherine's calls became infrequent, reduced to shallow conversations about Lily's extracurriculars. Robert grew distant, spending long hours in the study or taking solitary walks. Then, one evening, he came to her with quiet finality. "Margaret," he said, his voice firm but sorrowful, "I think we should live apart for a while." Her breath caught. "Robert, please, no. I need time to think." He interrupted gently. "And so do you. I've transferred most of our savings to Emma's education fund. Lily already has more than enough." Those words hit her like a physical blow. As he packed a small suitcase, she sat motionless on the velvet sofa, staring at the golden embroidery of their wedding anniversary cushions. The door closed softly behind him, and with it, decades of security and pride slipped away. A year later, spring returned to Alexandria. In the Wilson family's yard, the dogwoods bloomed again. Emma, now 9, played soccer with her friends, her laughter ringing across the white picket fence. "Nice shot," a neighbor called out cheerfully. Jennifer brought out a tray of lemonade and cookies. "Snack time," she announced. Emma ran over, cheeks flushed with joy. "Mom," she said between sips of lemonade, "we wrote essays in class today about what makes us proud." "Oh, what did you write about, sweetheart?" Emma smiled, leaning against her mother's shoulder. "I wrote about my hard-working mom, my kind dad, and my honest grandpa." Jennifer's eyes shimmered with tears. "That's beautiful, honey." Meanwhile, across town, at Maple Garden, a modest nursing home surrounded by blooming azaleas, Margaret Thompson sat by the window of her small private room. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced by simple department store clothes. Yet, there was peace in her face now, a quiet acceptance that no luxury could ever buy. "Mrs. Thompson, it's time for gardening club," a caregiver called softly. "Yes, thank you," she replied with a small smile. Her hands, once adorned with diamonds, now held a simple trowel, tending to a pot of bright geraniums she'd grown herself. The flowers bloomed vigorously, small, defiant bursts of life. That afternoon, Emma and Lily visited. Their relationship, once divided by pride and jealousy, had healed. They brought her a framed picture from Emma's school recital. "Look, Grandma," Emma said proudly, "I won first place." Margaret's hands trembled as she took the photo. "That's wonderful," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Robert, who still visited her once a month, sat beside her later that day. The two spoke quietly on the garden bench. "You've changed," he said softly. "Yes," Margaret answered, "but perhaps too late." He reached over, taking her hand. Better late than never. That evening, as the sun set over Maple Garden, Margaret looked up through the small window. The light painted her face with hues of gold and lavender. Her whisper floated upward, fragile yet full of peace. "Lord, thank you for letting me understand, even if it took a lifetime." The church bells in the distance began to ring, no longer a symbol of pride, but of grace finally understood. "Anger. Margaret." His voice cut through the stillness of the sanctuary like a thunderclap. Heads turned, murmurs rippled through the congregation, and even the pastor's voice faltered mid-sermon. Light from the stained glass windows spilled over Robert's face, illuminating the deep lines of fury and disappointment that carved his expression. "Robert, what's wrong?" "This is church," Margaret hissed under her breath, mortified by the staring eyes around them. Her manicured hands clutched her pearl necklace as if its cool touch could calm her nerves. But the moment she met her husband's eyes, she saw something unfamiliar, an anger she had never witnessed in 40 years of marriage. "I want an explanation." Robert's voice boomed again, reverberating through the high ceiling. "Why this difference between our granddaughters? Tell me, Margaret, answer me, before Christ." "Robert, please, social appearances." The word barely left her lips before Robert's fury rose higher. The authority that had once commanded entire boardrooms now filled the church. "Social appearances?" he thundered. "In 40 years of marriage, I've never been so ashamed. What have we been valuing all this time?" A tense silence swept over the sanctuary. The air was heavy, suffocating. Even the pipe organ's resonance seemed to retreat into stillness. "You don't understand," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "In this world, appearances matter." Robert's hand trembled slightly as he pointed toward the altar. "What appearances justify crushing a child's heart? What kind of image demands we treat our own blood as less?" His voice cracked, carrying not only anger but years of buried disappointment. "Christmas gifts, birthdays, family dinners, I've heard enough. What have we become? Margaret, is this the sum of our family's faith?" Lily is what?" His voice shook with disbelief. "Because she's Catherine's daughter? Because her father wears suits and works in a bank while Jennifer's husband wears a construction helmet? You think that matters before God?" The congregation watched with rapt attention. Even the elders whispered among themselves, their eyes wide. The pastor stood frozen behind the pulpit, powerless to intervene. "This," Robert continued, voice trembling, "is not the love our church preaches, not the equality Christ died for. And you," he stopped, unable to finish. Beside him, little Emma sat frozen, her small hands clutching her dress. She didn't fully understand the argument, but she felt it. Her grandfather's anger was for her. "Come here, Emma." Robert's voice softened. He lifted her into his arms, his large hands trembling slightly as they rested on her back. "Grandpa will make this right," he whispered. "I promise, before God." Tears streamed down Emma's cheeks, but these were not tears of pain, they were tears of relief. Margaret stood frozen, surrounded by judgmental eyes. The click of her Christian Dior heels echoed through the sanctuary as she turned and fled down the marble aisle. Every step sounded like a piece of her carefully constructed life shattering behind her. The fall. From that Sunday onward, Margaret Thompson's kingdom began to crumble. Her influence at First Presbyterian, built over decades of luncheons, charity events, and whispered alliances, vanished almost overnight. "Margaret," said Elizabeth Montgomery, the Women's Association president, her tone awkward, "we've decided to review the selection of officers for this year's charity bazaar." Margaret's smile faltered. She understood. It was a polite dismissal. By the next week, she found herself excluded from committees she had once led. At Sunday services, her friends, once eager to share pews and gossip, now turned their faces away. In choir practice, the space beside her remained empty. At the bridge club, Elizabeth avoided her gaze. "We've decided to limit membership starting this month," she said curtly. The following week, a notice arrived from the Alexandria Garden Club. Her membership had been suspended for violating dignity regulations. Her prized garden photos, once showcased in the annual calendar, were quietly removed. The dominoes fell one by one. Invitations to luncheons stopped arriving. The Windsor family, old friends and patrons, called to say, "Unfortunately, the Christmas party is overbooked this year." Margaret hung up before the sentence ended. She understood perfectly. Even within her family, distance grew. Catherine stopped bringing Lily to dinner. "Mom," Catherine said over the phone, her voice unsteady, "Lily's been acting strange. Kids at school don't want to play with her. They say they don't want to become like Grandma." Margaret's chest tightened. For the first time, she saw the ripples of her own actions. The separation. That evening, Robert stood before her in the study. "Margaret," he began, his tone calm but unyielding, "I think we should separate for a while." Her teacup trembled in her hand. "Robert, please. This isn't punishment," he said. "It's reflection. I'm moving to the lake house. You need to think about what truly matters." He paused, then added quietly, I've also decided to transfer most of our savings to Emma's education fund. Lily already has more than enough. This is what fairness looks like. Margaret's knees gave way. She sank onto the sofa, her breath shallow. The room that once symbolized luxury, the crystal chandelier, the marble floors, the antique fireplace, felt cold and lifeless. Outside, the garden bloomed as beautifully as ever, yet it no longer belonged to her world. Her phone buzzed. Street, James Luxury Senior Living. She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze drifted to a stack of brochures on the coffee table. Ordinary nursing homes, modest rooms, pastel covers promising peaceful living. For the first time, Margaret whispered a prayer not for prestige or forgiveness, but for strength. "Oh Lord, help me understand." The ticking of the clock was the only reply. 1 year later, spring. A new season had come to Alexandria. In Jennifer's backyard, the sound of children's laughter floated through the air. Emma, now 9, chased a soccer ball across the green lawn as her friends cheered. "Nice shot, Emma," a neighbor called out. Snack time. Jennifer's voice rang from the porch. She carried a tray of lemonade and cookies, her eyes soft with pride. "Mom, today we wrote essays about what makes us proud," Emma said, nibbling on a cookie. "Oh?" Jennifer smiled. "And what did you write?" "I wrote about my hard-working mom, my dedicated dad, and my honest grandpa." Jennifer's throat tightened. She reached out and hugged her daughter, whispering, "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart." Maple Garden. Across town, in the modest Maple Garden nursing home, Margaret Thompson lived in a small private room overlooking a patch of roses. The space was plain, yet bright with sunlight. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced by soft cardigans and simple blouses. On the windowsill sat pots of geraniums she tended herself. "Mrs. Thompson, gardening club starts soon," called a nurse gently. Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes, thank you." On Sunday afternoons, Emma and Lily visited. Their laughter filled the small room like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Grandma, look." Emma held up a photo. "I won first place in the piano recital." Margaret's hands trembled as she took it. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she whispered, her eyes shining. For the first time, her praise came not from obligation, but from love. Robert visited once a month. They sat together on the bench by the small garden. "You've changed," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied softly, "but perhaps too late." He didn't answer, but his silence carried forgiveness. Margaret rarely went to church now. Instead, she prayed in the home's tiny chapel, a simple wooden cross, a vase of fresh flowers, and sunlight through a plain window. It was there she finally learned the meaning of grace. One evening, as twilight bathed her room in gold, Margaret gazed out the window. The laughter of her granddaughters echoed faintly in her memory. "Lord," she whispered, "thank you for giving me time to understand love." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting her room in gentle light, neither grand nor tragic, but peaceful. For the first time in her life, Margaret Thompson was truly at peace.